Mr. Joshua Hansen, the man himself. Thank you so much for being here today. It's so good to see you. How are you doing, Joshua?
Hey, I'm doing excellent. Thank you very much for having me, and I'm real excited about this myself.
No, I am absolutely thrilled. I had such a wonderful time speaking with you and Zaruba when we had that conversation on education. I've enjoyed, with Raymond, you recently had a discussion, all the work you've done with Johannes and the conference. What you're doing is so important. It's one thing to have a sense that there's something wrong with academia and intuition. It's an entirely another matter to put that in terms that can be understood and then to be shared in a manner that other people can understand and comprehend. So that work that you're doing is so important. So would you mind to tell people about the work you do, the name of your channel, your work, and the things of that nature, Mr. Hansen?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot for having me on. I
Of course.
appreciate it. And, again, I'm Joshua Hansen. I'm an independent scholar, and my current research trajectory is what I'm calling Metacritique, which is
Hmm.
an attempted demystification of culture and hypermodernity. And right now I'm focusing on three main areas that I think are the largest sort of idols on the contemporary scene. This would be academia, science, and the internet. And basically, I'm furthest along into, my critique of, the university and so
Hmm.
forth. This by way of what I'm calling academiology, something that I believe is both more fundamental and far more radical than something like, let's say, critical university studies. And so, in the course of, being in this space, I've been grappling with these questions, about the respective figures of, let's say, the philosopher, the academic, the scholar, the intellectual, and so on. And so I kept coming across the name of Julien Benda and Le Treason de Clerks, the treason of the intellectuals. And so, I read the text, and after looking into it, it turns out it's also mentioned in a number of places. For instance, Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, it comes up there briefly. But more significantly, it is one of the key texts in Edward Said's Representations of the Intellectual,
Hmm.
where he basically contrasts Benda's sort of Enlightenment universalism against, let's say, Antonio Gramsci and, sort of his depiction of the intellectual coming out of the prison notebooks and so forth.
Hmm.
And I found a couple other, popping up in a couple other places, such as there's an excellent text by a gent named Thomas Docherty from Warwick, and it's called The New Treason of the
Huh.
Intellectuals. And then I went back a couple of decades. I thought this was funny. Ernest Gellner, he writes, this was a somewhat short essay, but it's called Le Treason de la Treason de Clerks. So the treason of the intellectuals. So, that's another one that I read for this, but, I'm very much looking forward to the conversation, and thank you very much for having me on.
Of course, and like I said, it's so incredible to find an individual that's in the center of this conversation about college intellectualism, the thought, these meta critiques, because there's not many people that do that. I mean, you go off to college, it's kind of the thing. If you say go off to be educated, then you are in the system, not necessarily looking at the system in which the learning is occurring, and so you're already assenting to whatever truth that system in of its own nature is portraying or showing or suggesting. That's always one of my favorite parts of like Postman's and Subversive Education and Subversive Act, where it's like, the classroom is structured like a trivia game. Teacher asks a question, who can answer it first? And they raise their hand. And you're led to believe that an educated person, therefore, in just that structure, is someone, therefore, that's good at trivia, as opposed to someone who, say, can explore topics that no one knows the answer to, figure out what terms need to be defined, all these other intellectual acts that are not suggested by the structure of education that you need to learn. And so a lack of a metacritique is so incredibly important. And what's terrifying, of course, the college isn't going to like a metacritique because no one likes to be critiqued, right? You like to be the person doing the critique. You like to critique society. You like to critique everyone else and what they're doing wrong. But the idea of you being critiqued, oh, that's no good. It's like, who watches the Watchmen, right? Who critiques the critics? Who critiques the way that the intellectualizes about the intellectuals? They don't like to do that, which then of course means that the university doesn't carry out that self regulation, And that can lead to, say, the tyranny of the intellectuals. And I'm so glad that you suggested this book and that we read it, because, like I said, it's just funny to me how you can go through life and you don't know what books you haven't read, right? And you don't know what you don't know. And it's one of the reasons why a continual life of learning is important, because there's always, like with Davoud and John, I never knew about Benjamin Fontaine, and they wanted to read Benjamin Fontaine. I'm like, my gosh, how did I not know about this person? And you keep going. Which then, kind of funny enough, college is always talking about the need for lifelong learning, but that's not exactly what necessarily occurs. Once you get your power, once you get your certification or whatever and so forth, why would you continue to learn? Because all that could do is possibly you learn something that would undermine the power that you've established, or that could be a threat to the things that you've made. So there actually becomes an incentive not to do it. But this is all to say that I think what you're doing as a metacritique of the university, since critics don't like to be critiqued, that necessarily has to be done, because the system is teaching people things that they don't even know that they're being taught, that then they go into the society and enact, that then the society has to deal with. And then if that has destructive impacts, people have not even been taught the ability to see those destructive impacts as destructions, because the colleges determine what is knowledge. So knowledge about that destruction would not even be it would not even be possible for you to absorb as knowledge. And so it's almost like a Calvinistic total depravity that starts to occur, where you lose the capacity to even know that you're depraved, because the categories of knowledge have been set by the things causing the depravity, where the depravity cannot be defined as depravity. So to me, it just suggests how important what you're doing is.
Yeah, hey, Benny, thanks. As part of that, I would call that something like the academic gaze. And, there's all sorts of, pathways that we can, that, and then also the issue of basically, getting paid to, presumably solve problems that, that the totality of the system was instrumental in creating, and so forth. But, yeah.
Oh no, and what would you say? And then we'll get into the book. But of some of the things that you've learned about the academic system, or that you've learned, or that you've read about, that have been most surprising to you, most shocking, or would you say maybe another way to take it? You can take this however you like. Have been some of the most important ideas that you've come across in your metacritique that you think people need to realize? And that's a very open-ended question, but I'm just curious how you would reply to that.
Sure. I think that the main issue would be something along the lines that the contemporary university is fully hypermodern, in the sense that it lacks almost any justification other than, that it provides some sort of ancillary benefit. So, hypermodernity, we have an inversion of form and function. So you could look at somebody like Bill Redding's in The University in Ruins, where he's basically saying, hey, the university, through a sequence of shifting raison d'etres, is now at the point where, there's one that's either lacking or it's basically hollow. I think at the time he was writing, we were talking about corporate excellence, and whatever that might entail. So basically, on that view, now the foremost thinkers, like in philosophy of education that I've seen, the only ones who can articulate a justification for the contemporary university system, which, by the way, it's kind of a weird sort of question to ask somebody, like, hey, what's the justification for the university? But the only one that I've seen that is like coherent, even though as we'll see, there's some issues there, is a text that's called A Perfect Mess by a gent at Stanford, who's arguing that the university system is a powerful economic engine. And so now, we have this definitional issue as far as, like, what does education entail? What is intellectualism? Where does the sort of life of the mind fall into this whole thing? And so on and so forth. And as you see, we have a bit of a conflict here.
That's outstanding. It reminds me, it's almost like people say, oh, go to college to get a good job, right? Which, right there's always something like strange about that, because it's like, well, wait, so the point of education is to get out and to do something other than to be educated? That's kind of weird. But you see, the thing is, like, I like to talk about how colleges have a kind of monopoly on credentials, where in order to get a good job, you have to go through college. Well, we talk about in markets, in economics, how monopolies create inefficiencies, where, for the example, you can have a terrible system, but if it has a monopoly, it continues to exist simply because it has a monopoly on that function. But if you can remove the function into other realms, say the internet or the ed tech that Johannes and Bard and Last were talking about, that would break up the monopoly. In the same way that, people talk about too big to fail, or if this system goes down, the whole thing goes down. Well, when you have a too big to fail system, it may stop providing value, but yet continues to exist, because if it goes down, it would pull the whole thing down with it. So one of the reasons you want, it becomes very problematic when a system is perpetuated simply because it has a monopoly, or a too big to fail kind of system. It's like, well, if colleges go down, that's like the main organizing principle of society and how we determine who gets what jobs, that could take down the whole thing. It's like, wait a minute, you're telling me then that we're keeping the university system simply because of a threat? Or simply because of a monopoly? How does that have, you're like, well, that doesn't seem like it's in function of anything positive. It would almost be at that point like, oh, you go to college because you don't want a bad job. That's not really a reason. That's more like a negative. It's like, oh, well, I don't want to end up poor, therefore I go to college. That's not like convincing you that college in of itself is good. And let me ask you if you got this impression from the book, because I had the impression that one of the things he's critiquing is the idea that the intellectual, which he calls the clerk, is tied to a focus and an incubation and consideration of the quote unquote non-practical, if you will, things that cannot be practiced, and that therefore the intellectual is someone who's not to have practical concerns. And then, he's like, it's a great betrayal, because what has happened is now intellectuals have practical concerns, or where truth is use. Truth is a thing that you can use, something that you can employ, something that you can practice. And it's interesting for Julien that therefore he thinks is going to lead to radical violence. There's going to be totalizing war, which of course, one of the reasons this book is so stunning is because it's happening before the World War. And then it turns out that he's correct. You have the mass violence. You're like, oh, this guy may have been onto something. And was that your impression, where he's saying that a big role of the intellectual is the preserving of, dare I say, timeless truths, non-conditional truths, these sort of values that the society needs, that the intellectual is supposed to be preserving and considering and giving to other people, where the intellectual today seems to have turned on that, which has led to all of this kind of like, what is even the point of the university?
Yeah, there's a lot there, obviously. He definitely says at a certain point that, the role is to confer sovereignty on the universal. And so this is something that in the Gellner text, he's critiquing his, putative Platonism here and so forth. So, that's one potential thread there. Then another thread would be, where he's talking about, it's almost now we have a almost world historical shift where it's like a Machiavellian praxis is something that has become almost like a categorical imperative somehow. And that we've actually gone beyond Machiavelli in the sense that he even knew that like what he was counseling was, wrong, so to speak. So basically there's a shift of consciousness, maybe along the lines of like, there's some things that one cannot unthink, perhaps. That's definitely one angle there. And, then something else that comes into this is if we look at like Gramsci, Gramsci obviously, he's basically in prison in Italy, and as a Marxist, he's trying to facilitate mass movement, and so he has a radically different view of like he believes that anybody is basically a philosopher, and that he has a much more inclusive perspective of who or what the intellectual is, although with technics that does lead to a little bit of an issue down the road that we could get to. And in the meantime, Benda has this somewhat elitist view of who the intellectual is, but so in like Edward Said, he kind of splits the difference. In part he is with Benda in certain respects. Ultimately, on my own view, if I had to say, who the intellectual is, it's somebody who comes to embody the idea, much the same way that, like, Hegel would say that art is something that is like, the sensuous appearance of the idea, something along these lines, right? And what that means is that these people have to live it. And as a consequence of that, it's a very high bar that Benda is putting forward there, where he's invoking like Socrates and, people who have gone to their death and so forth. You could jump there, you could jump in there with the whole list of people who have been exiled, burned, and, so on and so forth. And so with these different perspectives on who or what the intellectual is and what that entails, there's also at the heart of this whole thing, I think it really touches on theory of human nature in the sense, like, let's say you believe with Aristotle that, people tend towards the mean. Well, then, the intellectual is going to be the few rather than the many. And, let's say like Spinoza, I reluctantly quote him, but hey, when you're right, you're right. Spinoza, he says something like, basically, things that are excellent are as difficult as they are rare. And so basically, if you take that perspective and then apply that to, this sort of scenario, you're gonna, and you endorse, like, let's say, a somewhat pessimistic view of human nature, you're gonna get a different rendering here. This is where, this idea that sort of, this kind of metaphysic or what have you, it's all inclusive, like it has to be a totality, and so forth. But
yeah, there's something so, I'm reading the book, and it's very difficult not to read it and have the sense where he's warning. He's saying,
look, if intellectuals do not, I almost want to call them, you brought up Plato. It does seem like there's almost forms that we could talk about generally. Like there are these kind of forms that the intellectual needs to be very concerned about, or we could call non-conditionalities. That's not a term, but I'm going to make it up. Something that is true regardless of the condition. There's a universal to it. It's not contingent. It is the case. And that it seems to be suggesting that if we lose that, well, then we're going to fall into violence, which is so fascinating. Because usually you hear that truth is power and that truth is violence, but here the argument is, no, it's the removement of truth that then leads to all the violence and the trouble or the breakdown of society, where there's this kind of double action that's occurring. That's very, very interesting. And it makes me think as well, because there's also a notion here that intellectuals are still, in a sense, intellectualizing, even if they no longer care about forms. But it's like a non-grounded intellectualism. It's not toward anything. It's toward use. But the problem is use seems too unbound. Use is too conditioned by the socioeconomic order and what people to do. So it's under people as opposed to over people. And it seems to be that if a society loses this thing that is over them, rather it be a kind of form, well, then they can fall into violence because nothing unifies them. It's almost like you lose a common language. Like people, I don't have to know the exact same words I don't have to speak the exact same way you do, but we both need to generally know, if you're going to be my neighbor and I'm going to work with you, we need to know the same language, right? In the same way that we both have to, we may not agree on freedom, we may not agree on justice, we may not agree totally on human nature, but we have to be within the same kind of relative general band, range, if you will, so that we can organize and communicate. Otherwise, thinking becomes impossible. There's not enough similarity even to think. Communication becomes impossible. And so I was reading it. I guess it was interesting to me because the other thing that happened is recently I went back on Plato's Republic. And I was reading book 7. The funny thing, I'm convinced that a great book is one that when you glance at, you realize you should read it again. Like just glancing at Plato's Republic, I'm like, oh, why haven't I read this like way more? Because like in the end of book 7, I found it really interesting where when he's talking about forms, he's like, okay, even if you're laying on your back, you may not see forms. Forms are not simply the things you look at. And he kind of describes the orbit of a planet, where he's like, the form is not the planet, but it's more like the orbit. So he has that debate with, I can't remember who he's talking to, but he's like, oh, we should study astrology, astronomy, like the planets. And Plato's like, yeah, that's better than some things, but I kind of rather do something more like geometry, because geometry is when you're studying the orbits, like the thing that the planet follows, as opposed to the planet itself. And I guess for me, something kind of clicked where I was like, oh, it's almost like forms are the orbits or the tracks that things follow to be themselves. Like, for example, like the form of a leaf is what keeps it a leaf even as it ages or as it changes colors or things like that. And it's like a kind of path that it follows. Whereas, so I guess is what I'm saying. So it's almost like if societies don't have forms, they can't formulate along a track that makes them sensible, that makes them conceptualable and something that people can share in. And so if societies lose forms, then they can't formulate together. And therefore, society becomes very difficult to do. But at the same time, of course, forms can be used to oppress. I can say that the true leaf is this one, and everything that's not the true leaf is therefore a false leaf, so it can be used in a problematic way. But I guess what I was thinking, it's almost like the intellectual has to find this fine balance between defending the non-conditional form, but then not letting it be so oppressive that instead of there being a range in which we can share but still have difference, it becomes totalitarian. So that was kind of a sense of what I was reading. And I don't know, that was just a thought I had to think about Plato's forms. And I guess for some reason I was like, oh, that kind of made a little more sense to me. And I was thinking about that as I was reading this book.
Yeah, I think he was definitely at his strongest when he was talking about moderation and justice and so forth. You know, I think it's quite notable that, you know, he basically predicts World War II in this text, and he's correct, you know, which is somewhat fascinating. Now, the one thing that I find interesting is that apparently after World War II, I think it was in like 1946 or so, he attended, Benda attended a conference where Carl Jaspers was in attendance, and so the two of them, they both presented, Jaspers presented the idea of the university, and Benda presented the treason of the intellectuals. I'm taking this from Doherty's text. He opens up by describing this. And so what I find fascinating about this is that Benda adjusted the position that he's articulating in this book a little bit, and he was trying to go towards even more universality. So let's say universality in terms of like science. Of course, he was trying to suggest some sort of like universal language, which I think he might have suggested French. You know, we can table that suggestion. But nevertheless, so this movement towards like universal science as you know, as a pathway forward. What I feel like's going on there is that in all likelihood, he's probably appealing to something like, you know, the Humboldtian sort of, you know, ethos of like, you know, the free, untrammeled, you know, pursuit of scientific knowledge, as opposed to what we presently have today, where it's something like, you know, we're talking about intellectual property, corporate data, and what's been called like the crime of reason, where, you know, certain areas become foreclosed as a consequence of like, you know, intellectual property protections and so forth.
I've not heard the phrase crime of reason, but that's
really great. And I didn't know about that conference. That's really fascinating, because I was going to, because I think a lot of people today have this kind of feeling that, oh, science can be the non-conditional, like facts are non-conditional. You know, 2 + 2 = 4. It doesn't matter who you are and what you think or your ideology. Likewise, facts are facts, regardless your ideology. So there's this kind of notion that facts and science can be the thing that unifies society together. And I think that's where, you know, maybe some people who are on the, you know, if we generally call it the postmodern side, who associate truth with power, they want to say, well, what we're saying is that metaphysical truth is power and can oppress, and we'd rather just kind of have science be the unifying principle. That's what I could hear some people say. But, you know, that always brings you to the fact, you know, Cardinal Newman once had this part where he said, words don't tell you what they mean, which I always thought was hilarious. And the point he's trying to say is you have to interpret words. Well, likewise, the problem with facts is facts don't tell you what they mean. You know, for example, I can tell you that there are, you know, there's 2 heaters in this room, but that doesn't tell you if I need a third one. That doesn't tell you if I have it too hot or not, because that's going to bring it back to me. Like, facts don't tell you how to structure them, right? Or they don't tell you what narrative they point to. So one of the things I think has been very problematic, what I like to say, you know how Kant talks about pure reason, the critique of pure reason. I kind of want to talk about a critique of pure observation. You know, you cannot from pure observation get the meaning of that observation or determine what it should do. You have to interpret it, which this is kind of what's kind of funny, is because there's such a stress in Derrida and other people that you can't escape interpretation. And yet, what I like to say, you know how Kant talks about pure reason, the critique of pure reason. I kind of want to talk about a critique of pure observation. You know, you cannot from pure observation get the meaning of that observation or determine what it should do. You have to interpret it, which this is kind of what's kind of funny, is because there's such a stress in Derrida and other people that you can't escape In some of the followers of Derrida, or if we just take more post-modernity, there can be a simultaneous strange, there's a deconstruction of metaphysics, but then a lack of concern about the need to interpret facts into a narrative that gives them meaning. That's what you can see. I don't think Derrida made that mistake. I think Derrida himself seems to have been aware of some of those problems. But, it's never the original thinker that tends to be the source of the problems. It's the followers afterward.
That's what I found that to be exactly the case. And I have to say that, like, reading Edward Said, preparing to discuss this text, representations of the intellectual and so forth, I really started to, even though I disagree with this guy in a lot of areas, the way that he puts this stuff forward, it's incredibly, well sourced, highly elegant presentation, very careful thinker and stuff like this. And I feel like a lot of people that, follow on, let's say, either there or, all kinds of other directions, they do so in a way that I think that he even condemns in the text himself. I think you even see that with Nietzsche, where Nietzsche tries to foreclose the possibility of taking, his work in certain directions and so forth. And then nevertheless, that's what ends up coming to the fore.
Oh no, I personally never had any trouble with, say, Orientalism, where the kind of structuring of the East in a way to the West that's going to be supporting Western hegemony. That in of itself is not a problematic idea. It's where you then go, it's kind of like in computer science, I guess they talk about overfitting and underfitting. If you underfit something, it's too distinct from the truth to be useful. But then overfitting is taking something true and using it to explain too much. Another term I like to talk about, monotheism, our tendency to take a single truth and try to explain everything according to it. It's when people use Orientalism as opposed to a corrective of epistemological methods as a deconstructive of all epistemological narratives, or a sort of equalizing where all ways of thinking are equal. Now, again, you want to have different ways of thinking, but which way of thinking is best under which conditions depends on the situation. You need a toolbox, but it would be an entirely different matter to sort of suggest that, say, all Western thought is therefore a hegemonic expression that is keeping down the world. Maybe some of it is, maybe some ways it is, but you have to do the work of going through it. But there's this tendency, I think, to take Edward Said, who's making, I think, a fair case in Orientalism, and then potentially use that against all of Western thinking, which would be a vast generality that I don't think Mr. Said himself would be aware. It's just like, again, Derrida wants to suggest, dichotomies. Let's say justice versus injustice can be used to capture thought, because sometimes there are actions that transcend the categories of justice and cannot be understood by that dichotomy. But if you're trapped thinking in terms of that dichotomy, well, then you may not be able to understand the situation you're in. So you want to deconstruct dichotomies. But Derrida was not saying that dichotomies never apply and that there's no situation where there's an either or. He wants to just be aware of the possibility of being trapped within an either or. In the same way that Edward Said is not saying that all Western ideas or knowledge are structured in a way for Western hegemony, but that they can be structured in such a way for Western hegemony. And that's a very valid argument. It's just very interesting. There's something about human beings that we can't help but overfit. It's like we just can't help. It seems very natural to take things and take them too far. And perhaps, that's one of the things that the good education will keep one from doing.
Something I find fascinating about this whole thing, and one thing I'm very interested is Said on culture and imperialism and kind of how that cashes out. But before we get to that, as far as there's the issue that is raised by Hannah Arendt is very fascinating here. She seems to be invoking the fundamental attribution error to basically, make the claim, that Benda is, violating that by he's trying to, condemn the intellectuals, whereas the entire philosophical, metaphysical background had shifted radically, facilitating, the rise of totalitarianism. If that is the case, to what extent does that hold? I just find that to be an interesting consideration, because so we have this treason, which, just so I could get it out of the way, I staked out probably what his three main claims are. And I think that it's absolutely the case that this stuff occurred. So it would be that the intellectuals, according to Benda, had endorsed nationalistic, class-based and ethnic passions coupled with xenophobia, and that, basically they had become ministers of war. That is how he puts it. So we know that this happened,
Right.
So he got that. Second, basically, this idea that like realpolitik had been elevated to, an unprecedented level, almost something like a moral imperative. I think that you could probably, here's how he says it. And this, you can go back to Plato and this, where they're determining what is just based on the accomplished fact. Right. So basically, we're talking like Callicles, Thrasymachus type action here. And then, finally, basically, on his view, this is something that constituted a total abdication on the part of the intellectuals, and that, it was the deification of the appetites and a complete bankruptcy is actually how he put it. There was a lot of strong words, and he's appealing to, like disinterested, some sort of objectivity, of course, that is, this is and he's a secular humanist, I guess. And so he's promoting this enlightened universality, I suppose. So, those are his claims. I think that those claims are largely true. But so what would you agree with most of that, or what do you say?
I think you staked out the main claims very well. And, that's a movement, generally, I guess I'd put it, there's this movement from the intellectual, the clerk, focused on the non-practical, to thinking that they move into the practical because that's the realm of the true. And this, of course, is all occurring when you have this strong belief in the power of intellect, rationality to organize society in a successful way. This is before, say, a Friedrich Hayek, who makes that incredible distinction between the accidental knowledge you can only know by being in, and the abstract knowledge. This is all in the realm where there is a strong belief in the ability of individuals who just follow, what is most rational to make the better society. So therefore, the rational enters into the political, because if you believe rationality can make the perfect society, well, then you need to enter into the realm where you can actually do the making, and that would become the political. But of course, the problem is, one, if we take Friedrich Hayek seriously, that, abstract knowledge is not the same as the knowledge of how many plastic spoons you need to order next week for the restaurant down the street. That particular knowledge, you could also say. And, Friedrich Hayek wants to basically say that 99.9% of the knowledge that makes society run is particular knowledge, not abstract knowledge. And the organization of countless variables that no single person can know, then no intellectual can organize entirely a society. They can have a role, and it seems to be an important role, but if they step outside of that role, then there's going to be a lot of mistakes. But of course, this is before all of that thinking. This is still in the age where people believe in reason to know all things, that all essential things. And this is where perhaps the form can be problematic, the Plato's form, because it's the idea that if we know the form, then we just make everything conform to the form. It is possible to know the form, and then it becomes totalitarian. And that's where I do think, say, Jonathan Rauch in Kindly Inquisitor, when he points out The Republic can be a terrible book, is correct. It can be a form of totalitarianism. But at the same time, what's so fascinating is, so, if we take someone like, so first off, I want to agree with your claims. Your claims are correct. Second, on the idea of the essentializing, Foucault and them can be correct, that essentializing can be a form of oppression. And also to kind of essentialize, to say the characteristic of an intellectual, all intellectuals are bad or something like that, that could be a problem. And there can be arguments, it depends on who you read, that the totalitarianism following an Adorno and a Horkheimer is a result of what I like to call autonomous rationality, the dream of the Enlightenment to totalize. But then we can go, well, no, they weren't rational at all because they were political realm to their own values. So it also gets into what you define as rational, right? If rationality leads to, that's kind of the funny thing about the word rational, because that's why, like, if we, I guess what I'm saying, if we conflate that with right, we can hear this idea that rationality can lead to totalitarianism, and our brains can go, well, they must have not been truly rational. They must have just thought they were rational. That's why they gave to that consequence. But that's why I do think it's so important to kind of understand that rationality is always relative to your truth and what you think is true, that you do that then you act rationally. But then the question is, how do you assent to what's true? And that might be where it's, that's where it's very problematic if you're xenophobic, if you're doing all the things that Benda is saying the intellectuals are doing, because then if they are believing in certain superiorities of a nation or a certain group, then they're going to organize a rationality that is going to bring that about and then think that's what everyone would do in their position because that's what's rational and that's what smart people do. So the truth that you've assented to, not out of rational means, but maybe your own prejudice, is then hidden behind a universal rationality that then you use to kind of oppress people and make you invincible to the claim. And that's also where something like Thomas Sowell is correct in Intellectuals in Society. So that can all happen, and those are all the things that rationality can be used to be power. But at the same time, if you don't have something like an unconditional form, you don't have anything to unify the society or some sort of range that people can operate in. And this is where I do like Philip Reef's book on the triumph of the therapeutic, where he's talking about you have to find this balance between givens and releases. Like if you have if you don't have any givens, if you don't have any forms per se, then you have no similarity to make a society understand one another or intellectual or comprehensible. They can't organize together. But then if you have no space for releases, well, that means there's oppression and totalizing, and there can be different troubles. And it would almost seem like a role of the intellectual is to help us find the balance between givens and releases, to find a kind of form that can unify us, but does not negate efface difference in that form. Because it's almost like today, we don't have enough similarity. That's why there's all the sense-making, tribalism, and all those different problems. But then if you have too much similarity, that can become a sameness that becomes oppressive. So it's kind of interesting. It's like you somehow have to find a middle road that requires a very heavy level of constant thinking in order to maintain a kind of balancing act. So those were some thoughts that I had, kind of relating all of that.
Yeah, I think a big thing that people tend to see is rationalization presented as rationality. On the one hand, that it is, I think it's pretty certain that that Hayek's calculation problem, is eventually they're going to attempt to solve it, through this is one of the threats of metaversality.
Yeah.
On my view is like, if the universal is not captured in the particular or vice versa, both, you have a situation where, you can have, so what they'll try to do is they're going to try to solve the calculation problem through planetary scale computation.
Yeah.
And so, basically through metrics and so on and so forth. And I think that hints at some of the, the totalitarianism of the future. But I was able to notice something very fascinating is that I think that you can trace out a genealogy from the Treason of the Intellectuals to the contemporary scene. So let's say, it's like a 1927 text. Then he sort of, he presents his book again after the war. So, we're in 1946. And between then and today, I think like probably the most important text for this, but that was actually failed in a sense, somebody actually took a chance and was wrong, and they admit that, but it's still a very good book, is by the gent Russell Jacoby, who coined the term public intellectual. And so his book, The Last Intellectuals, is a book where what he's basically arguing is that the generation of intellectuals, let's say like in the post-war period, that were in the public sphere, and he names plenty of them. One would be like, let's say like Walter Lippmann, for instance, right? He was not seeing them be replaced by a newer generation. And the reason he's claiming this is because he's saying that, with the massive expansion of academia, that basically people that were engaged in thinking, philosophy, social theory, what have you, were going to the university. And so what he was witnessing, on his view, was a missing generation. He later corrected this. He was writing this in the 80s. so then, he writes a foreword to it later on. He acknowledges this, and he says, it turns out that people did actually ultimately rise into this sort of position. Also, he wouldn't have been able to predict the effects of the internet, just like Gramsci, where Gramsci is talking about the conception of the intellectual, and he's sort of including in this, it seems to me, like the technical bourgeoisie. And the issue is, I would say that we're on the way to the point where people that are in the technical bourgeoisie are closer, in some instances, doing like digital labor. They can be closer to like a mode of intellectual suicide, because their cognitive like faculties are sapped for such a large portion of each day, engaged in symbolic representation, as opposed to, like, let's say, living with ideas, right?
Right.
So anyway, so that's something that he couldn't have anticipated. And so, like, obvious, of course, Jacobi is somebody who acknowledges this stuff. But so, okay, so the locale, the space where the putative intellectuals are located is something that shifts to the university. Well, now, this is something that there's an entire story connected with this, in the sense that now you have what's called the fall of the faculty, which is the rise of the administration. There's a book by a gent by the name of Benjamin Ginsberg. He writes about this, how basically these administrators, they're taking the place over. They'll have meetings where a bunch of administrators will try to figure out what to do to improve, student experience, and they'll decide they need more administrators. So you have administrative bloat on the one hand, and then there's a book called The Last Professors by a gentleman by the name of Frank Donahue, and he's talking about the corporatization of the university at the same time. So ultimately, you have a scenario like between those texts, and then I'm trying to think what else would be relevant. Well, how about the idea that now, okay, so now this gets really interesting, because, for instance, there's a number of university professors, like one would be, like a couple at Yale, like one would be, for instance, Jason Stanley, and he is, something I noticed that he tends to do is, like, if somebody is not necessarily just like a critic per se, but he seems to take like criticism of the university system as being a mode of anti-intellectualism. But like what I'm claiming is that, first we would have to establish, where is it that the academic, the idea of the academic and the idea of the intellectual and intellectualism, what is the sort of, how do they overlap? And so, like, when I look at, for instance, Richard Hofstadter on, his text, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, what he's talking about is, by intellectualism, he means respect, for the life of the mind, right? And in the meantime, in the university system, it's increasingly, almost daily, even more intensified in its dedication to sort of, the technological sort of, techniques, the technological understanding of being, instrumental rationality, vocational training, capital autonomization, things of this nature. And so the idea here is that what is this actual overlap, that we're talking about, and, how does it manifest?
First off, you're like the world expert on
Everything involving academia. It's just magnificent. Just listening to you on the books that you reference. I don't have a way to give you any sort of giant plaque because I'm stuck on the other side of this computer, but I wish I could. It's just, I enjoy listening to you so much go through all of that. It's just remarkable. So thank you for the work that you've done to know those texts so that you could bring them up in such a powerful metacritique of academia. And I really appreciate that. You mentioned Hayek, the calculation problem. Unfortunately, arguably, a lot of what's going on in China with quantum computing, observation, surveillance is an effort to overcome the calculation problem. I do not think that people actually, Frederick Jamerson and Richard Rorty, who are on the liberal side, who are anti-capitalist, they at least understood the magnitude of that problem and how there was no solution to it at that point. And right now, the solutions that people are coming up to are very totalitarian and very problematic. That doesn't mean that capitalism, you almost have to make distinctions between capitalism, free markets, pricing mechanisms, all these different things. To defend the pricing mechanism as the only solution to the calculation problem is not to say that corporatism is good. But, a lot of people hear that and you have to go through that conversation. But, there's a lot of conversation now about new communities, dark Renaissance game bee on the store that they're talking about. And for me, the problems of the calculation problem, which is tied to the pricing mechanism, is paramount. And also the need to answer that problem also intensifies relative to scale, like how big you want to make the new society. Are we talking just a commune that you have on your farm? Well, then you don't have to worry about the calculation problem. But once you start talking about a new society or an entire new way to do things, the calculation problem is a very, very big deal. And so I appreciate, and like you say, I think, they're trying to, it would seem the metaverse, computers, this is all examples of how they're overcoming it. And I'm not sure if that, not all solutions to problems are good solutions.
So the last part of that, which maps on directly to what you're talking about. So as far as Doherty is concerned, what is the new treason of the intellectuals, right? So, we have Benda, which I agree with in part. And then, so now what he is claiming is basically that it's a combination of market fundamentalism and finance capital has basically taken over the university. And so hence you have more commercialization, corporatization, privatization. These are the standard critiques. And, where education becomes a luxury consumer good, rather than a public good. So I think he's absolutely correct about that. So, that's consistent with sort of, these various paradigm shifts and so on and so forth. But then we would come to, there may be a treason of the intellectuals in every epoch, perhaps, yes? What is the ultimate treason of the intellectuals? That is something that, I think I could stake out, what that is. I think it includes all these elements of, let's say Benda, Doherty, the entire narrative I gave, starting with Jacobi and all these other gentlemen. But I think that the ultimate treason, right, is that they've given up their humanity.
Yes.
And so they've become dehumanized, they've accepted basically anti-humanism in this sort of overall moral vacuum. And, there's the associated reduction to bare life. And, we're talking about triple O, object-oriented ontology, speculative realism, post-humanism, transhumanism, and so on and so forth. So that would be the first element. And then the second would be that they've allowed themselves to become completely demoralized. Yes. There's the text Education's End by Anthony Kronman, who was at Yale. And basically, he basically is talking about how university professors, they basically have seeded this entire thing. A big, like you were discussing, the fact-value distinction, that's definitely tied up in all of this. They believe that they've overcome the fact-value distinction by way of, human flourishing. But the problem is now, who is the flourishing for? Is it for, like the few, the many? Is it, this is where I like Said, where he's saying that some people use the idea of the West almost as if it were a god. Right. Which, I think that that's a pretty incisive critique. But on my view, that these two elements, the loss of humanity, total demoralization, these culminate in, it's a total abdication of the idea coupled with sanctimonious hypocrisy for the most part. And, there's almost, and this is the biggest issue, there's almost a total lack of awareness of what has transpired. And that's the biggest issue. And so this is something that I think raises, this is where Hannah Arendt's notion of invoking fundamental attribution error here is somewhat fascinating, but I have, I have adjusted. I'm happy to, as far as like, I don't feel the need to go around pointing fingers at anybody, A, and B, like there's basically, I don't have any ill will towards, let's say, like graduate students,
Sure.
people that are subject to adjunctification. There's an entire complex of this stuff, and that itself is basically a type of economic and social domination. I suppose that you could certainly blame. I think the ones the most deserving of blame would be like the grand philosophes of sort of royal academe, so to speak. I think that they should be on the hook. But to get around this, I've come up with, my own interpretive methodology, which is invoking Roland Barthes. I'm basically looking to proclaim the death of the academic as and what I mean by this is, an anti-intentionalist reading, of the figure of the academic text, in the sense that because of the way that, everything is structured, techno-capital, neoliberalism, and so on and so forth, it's almost as if the figure of the academic, and I'm talking about at the highest level, is, become a conduit, for capital, basically, for, its associated ideologies, for separating theory and practice, and so on and so forth. And then the idea here is that my anti-intentionalist reading of the academic text, it will create discursivity, for one thing, through the effacement of academic credentials and intentionality. That's the idea. And so the idea would be that this is actually a reclamation of humanity through, the putative death of the academic author, something like this.
Well, this is what's getting, if you that one
magnificent into this is getting at what to me is the critical, strange tension that has to be unwound, which is the idea that, okay, the intellectuals can destroy society if we follow like a Thomas Sowell or, different things. At the same time, an anti-intellectual society could be problematic. So what is the balance? Because there also seems to be, because if the intellectualism goes too far, then like you say, there's something about humanity that is in jeopardy, because you think everything can be put into technical, you can control, you can mine. And, the other thing too, I want to note before I forget, you mentioned Hofstadter, the anti-intellectualism in America. Thomas Sowell makes this interesting point where he's like, well, it's interesting. Lloyd, we don't tend to think of doctors, financial advisors, we don't tend to call them intellectuals. And yet their acts entail a lot of intellectual use. They're very smart. And he says it's kind of interesting because America has never necessarily been anti-doctor, anti-financier, anti-business person. It takes a lot of intellect to do a business. But the thing is, there seems to be a difference between that and what we call the intellectual, which seems to be the academic. And what Thomas Sowell wants to talk about is the intellectual is someone whose product is ideas and end product is ideas. Whereas like the doctor, they use ideas to say do surgery, the financier, they do ideas to do the economy and different things like that. And so when he defines the intellectual, so, basically Thomas Sowell wants to go on and be like, this intellectual class is very problematic. And I read that and I'm like, okay, I see what you're saying. Because he also wants to say they're not, there's no empirical test. Like if Marx or someone comes up with a bad idea, they still are a great philosopher and everyone's required to read them, even if they fail empirical tests. And he goes through the example of, say, all the economic ideas on how rent control is going to help the poor. And actually the results of it is that rent control causes rents to go up because people make less apartments, and it has the inverse impact and it doesn't work. But that doesn't stop people from publishing papers about it and getting, tenure and things like that. So he wants to be like, that's a problem, because it would seem like intellectuals then, they don't have an empirical test. And that's also the balance where, say, scientific verification can be good. Well, there's no verification, falsification can be good. But on the flip side, science cannot tell you what the facts mean. So there's all these intricacies here that have to kind of be unwound, because it would seem that if you don't have an intellectual, there's something about this intellectual class that when it goes into politics, it's almost like they're unbound, precisely because they're not susceptible to an empirical test so much, and then they can be very destructive. But if you don't have an intellectual class, you also don't have a social assent to a commonality of forms, of values that makes society being able to organize itself. So I guess as I'm reading, I'm always trying to find the balance between acknowledging the problems with the intellectual class, which arguably in academia to now are contributing to all of these very bad movements of power that are not good and also holding the society down. But then there seems to be something about the ability to think on ideas, and that you need to do that in order to have commonalities of values to make society possible. So that was something I think, I'm not sure what you think of that. It was just something I was thinking about, kind of parsing through it all.
Something ironic about that is the idea that therefore, Soul would be actually closer to somebody like Gramsci and his more inclusive sort of articulation of what the intellectual is. Whereas, at the same time, I have to say that I'm actually a little closer to Benda on this, because on the one hand, you have people that are scholars, right? And so now, if somebody's really going to embody the idea, they have to live it. They have to see it through to its natural conclusions. So if we're going to say, who is the intellectual, so to speak, basically my list would be something like, it's including people that were, killed, exiled, subject to torture, and so on and so forth. So we're talking about people such as, let's say, Anaxagoras, Socrates, Diogenes, Confucius, living most of his life in exile. Boethius, basically he's in prison and he writes this text that, we still have today. Jan Hus, he's basically burned. Giordano Bruno, burned, right? Spinoza is exiled.
Right.
Rousseau, I think he was having to do a lot of sneaking around in between like France and Geneva. Kierkegaard, basically, and I guess like if you wanted to, you could probably put Nietzsche into that boat where, they just, they totally gave themselves over to the idea. Let's say, then I also have people such as, let's say, William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist and stuff like this, must have been 30 years or more, just publishing in that area. Gramsci, he's writing from prison. Right? Hannah Arendt, she was basically on the run, I think from Germany to France, and then even in France, having problems. Jacques Ellul, he's in the French Resistance, for real. I think that there's like a Girardian quote where, many college professors seem to like think of themselves as being like a member of the French Resistance. And then I think of them like with a little beret on and stuff like this within the halls of academe. So I find that somewhat fascinating. Bonhoeffer, that would be another one. Simone Weil, Walter Benjamin, Wittgenstein, basically he wrote the Tractatus in a trench somewhere, what have you. Malcolm X, MLK, James Baldwin, these gents. How about the young Chomsky is somebody I think that you could add to that. And also Edward Said, and then, perhaps somebody like Julian Assange, who's basically, you know what I'm saying? He's looking at, he's going to be locked up. And so on and so forth. So that this would be something that's rare, somebody that's almost acting as like the conscience of society in a certain sense. And, they're embodying that to the maximum extent. That's kind of where I'm at with this whole thing.
Well, that's magnificent, because it's funny you bring all that up, because, I was
looking through Paul Johnson's Intellectuals, where basically he wants to go through all intellectuals are hypocrites and not very good people and different things like that. But it's almost like there's another class, like you're listing out. It's almost like you need a new phrase. Like I almost want to, like you have this intellectual class, which I sympathize quite strongly with Thomas Sowell's assessment of some of the problems with that. But then I'm reading Bonhoeffer's like the dangers of stupidity, and basically how stupidity is how you get totalitarianism. You're like, well, that's not good. And then you're also kind of saying, well, if we don't have a common assent to something non-conditional, then you get the meaning crisis, the lack of sense making today, all the different problems you have. So there seems to be, and the other thing too, is there seems to be a big difference between the intellectual act that tries to overcome the calculation problem by just saying, oh, it's all calculatable. There's nothing inherently human that you have to always honor, that you can't ultimately fit into an algorithm. Because in some respects, we can use Hayek's calculation problem as a defense against something that's ultimately human, something that you can't ultimately calculate because you have to be there to know it. You have to be in the shop. There's kind of a defense of the human element, the participation, the being in the particular element. There's kind of a defense of humanity in the calculation problem that Hayek is putting up. And there seems to be a difference in all of these, like someone like a Benjamin Fontaine, who's trying to defend, he calls it the irrational. I like to call it the non-rational, because it cannot be non-rational human element that if you lose, then there's only rationality, and that means everything is controllable. And there's something human that is forever lost. And so you need, and then of course the irony is if we follow like the Nash equilibrium, the funny thing is if everyone is rational, you get a suboptimal result following a Nash equilibrium. You know, that's a situation in game theory where if everyone does what's rational, stuff doesn't work out too well, which unfortunately a lot of people then interpret, oh, well then we can now be truly rational because we can find a solution to it. No, 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 no. You have to use actually a non-rational solution relative to that situation in order to get the optimal result that then afterward you can call rational. But if you take seriously the Nash equilibrium and some of the other game theory problems, that actually would unveil to you the need for quote unquote non-rationality, if you will, like a Benjamin Fontaine is defending. And there's something about all of these thinkers that you mentioned that appreciate and honor rationality, but they know there also has to be a living it out. There's a living element. And there's also something to them that thinks that whatever the quote unquote truth is, it is not something that they can make in service of them, but that they have to serve. It's almost like there's a difference. If we're going back to Plato's forms, there seems to be a radical difference between going, I want to learn about the forms in order to honor them and to kind of just want to observe them and to live in accordance with them myself, not over other people. Maybe I'll help them learn about them so they on their own free will can choose to form. There seems to be a big difference between, I guess I'll call it observing the forms and thinking you can control the forms or own the forms. And it seems like the intellectual class that's problematic moved, if we're following Benda, there's like a movement from people who want to observe the forms to people who want to own the forms and then enact the forms and then make themselves morally justified to conform the society to those forms because they own them. So there's some distinction there that it's almost like you therefore need a term different from intellectual because that's so weighted and associated with the academia. And I like you said scholars, that might be it, where the people who are observing forms are more scholars, whereas people who are trying to own forms are quote unquote intellectuals or maybe academics. You know, it's almost like there's I don't know, it's feeling to me like there's something with the terminology that makes it hard to get at this incredibly important distinction that because the life of the mind seems really important, but it also seems like it's dangerous. It's like fire, right? You know, if you play with fire, you can get burnt. But if you had a world where there was no fire, you couldn't cook and you couldn't stay warm. So it's some sort of balance there.
At the beginning of the conversation, you asked me, you know, if, you know, something surprising or, you know, shocking that I sort of like uncovered through my investigations at the university. And this is actually, we're right in the territory here. When we're talking about theory and practice, right? And this separation of theory and practice where you would just have like, you know, somebody trying to capture the forms versus, you know, they're failing to grasp, you know, the particular and the universal and vice versa. You know, I was thinking that, let's say you have like Nassim Taleb is executing the critique of skin in the game, right?
Yeah.
So that's the criticism, which is that, hey, these people have no skin in the game and so on and so forth. What I have found shocking is that basically on my anti-intentionalist reading of the university system, I am thinking that sort of the techno-capitalist function of the academic is actually to create space between theory and practice, because that's literally what ideology is. You know, this is where I'm there with Marx. You know, I'm not a materialist, but basically that's what's being critiqued by Marx is that, hey, theory and practice are totally separated with this idealism. And now we're in this historical, you know, we have, so like, you know, Marx is writing in the 1850s, you know, we have a good amount of time to look empirically and see, you know, what the state of affairs is. Because now we've had a shift. I have to develop these arguments further, but there's a shift from where, you know, the elite is basically, let's say, Hegelian, and you know they're debatably Hegelian in many ways today. That's fine, but now it's sort of like a physicalist, materialist conception is what is dominating, you know, the highest levels of society. Let's say, you know, like industry, the academy, and so forth. So basically, you know, technological understanding of being, and almost bordering on like techno-scientific irrationalism. And so now, you know, where before they were saying, you know, the transcendent, you know, this is tyranny, this is going to lead to totalitarianism. Let's say like Foucault's introduction to Deleuze and Guattari, you know, anti-Oedipus. You know, basically this is what he's driving at. But so now we have Deleuzian sort of immanence everywhere, and we have basically a mode of like immanent domination, and we can empirically show that. And so, you know, I want to return to Said very quickly. And, you know, basically in Culture and Anarchy, he's seeking to do these ideological unmaskings, right? And so he's doing an ideological unmasking of, like, let's say the British novel, right? And so he's looking at like Jane Austen's Mansfield's Park, and what he's showing is basically, hey, you know, you have all these well-to-do, or you know, basically socially upwardly mobile sort of like actors, and they're engaged in almost like, you know, they're engaged in like class activities of a certain sort, you know, social activities, consumption, and so on and so forth, with all the attendant sort of, you know, markers of distinction, right? And so in the meantime, the idea is that only one class is seen here, right, in this text. And that, you know, what's taking shape in the West Indies, which is, you know, basically bankrolling much of that activity, is something that is unseen.
Right.
And what this is basically Sir Thomas's sugar plantations in Antigua, you know, which is, so basically the unmasking here is that, you know, Said does not necessarily, he's not criticizing the artistic form, but he's saying that basically, you know, this is imperialism, and, you know, slavery is sort of at the heart of this sort of thing. And I agree that he's correct about this, right? But the thing is that, you know, this sort of hypocrisy and so forth, you know, I think it's present in every age. And that, you know, today, I think we have more of the same. We have a techno-capitalist mode of imperialism. And, you know, the university is central to this whole thing in a big way. And so, you know, the way it sort of shows itself from time to time is, you know, I've used this example several times, but you'll have public media attention. You know what I'm saying? At the highest rated sort of news networks covering things such as, let's say, you know, protests like at Yale over, you know, Halloween costumes and symbolic representation. Of course, you know, I would never advocate that somebody go deliberately offend another, because people are getting killed out here. So I would never do that. Sure. Nevertheless, you know, what's amazing about this, and, you know, this is the sad thing, is that, you know, there's people on the other side of the world that are unseen, just in the way that Said is talking about, who have had to sell their lives to make these costumes. And this is true also, you know, I've seen also reported in the news is, you know, they're protesting that the banh mi somewhere is inauthentic at some university, you know, sort of cafeteria. Or if they even call it that. But so, and in the meantime, you know, I believe that during COVID, that like there were people in the factories of Vietnam who were basically living inside of their factories to keep certain aspects of like supply chains going. And, you know, this is largely unseen. This isn't what's being reported. This isn't what's being protested about. But the university endowments, you know, they're all invested in Apple. Everybody is watching Netflix. And you know, basically, you know, people, they're all engaged in this sort of pleasurable world making, you know, that goes on in the comforts of academe. And so as it relates to imperialism, my view is basically that the contemporary university is nothing less than the equivalent of Mansfield Park.
That was magnificent, magnificent. Well, the point you're getting at, and I
I think that she is correct. Basically, the only critique is Metacritique. Because if the critique is happening within the system, so, you know, if you have theory and practice here, but underneath is an entire global system that is making possible the debate between theory and practice, or certain practice according to that theory, then that's just fine. That, you know, the thing underneath it all is not being critiqued in any way whatsoever, and it's sustained. So another way to put it, like in the, you know, if, you know, in Pride and Prejudice, if she's deciding if she's going to talk to Mr. Dorsey or not, and she has this idea if she loves him or not, and then she says, well, if I do, then I'll engage in the practice of going to his house. All of that debate between what is the right idea and what is the right practice of the character is occurring within a world that is possible because of a certain slave trade. But the whole background, if you will, the whole thing that's in the background or under it, making that debate between theory and practice possible, is not in the novel. It's kind of absent. It's not there. And yet that world of the novel would not be possible without that thing that is not there. And that's where I think, say, I'm not like entirely against some of the deconstructionist readings or Foucault or different things, because there's truth to all of that. The issue is, of course, the overfitting in different things like that, you know, where therefore Jane Austen somehow perpetuates injustice or different things, you know, by reading of Jane Austen, you should not do it. Well, it's not possible to have a society that does not have things under it supporting it. The question is, are you aware of those things? Have you become thoughtless of those things? Are you trying to correct those things? Are you trying to improve those things? All these other questions. That the problem of the novel in this sense, if we use that language, is when the reading of it leads to the not asking those questions anymore. That's when it can then be a function of ideology. And if I read some of the comparative, that's what I understand that they're saying. They're not going to the place where they're like, well, therefore burn all the books or don't read them anymore, which I think some of the followers may erroneously take it to. Again, it always seems to be that the original thinkers were much more nuanced in understanding, that the followers afterwards are the ones who can do the overfitting. But to the point of what you're saying on the idea of the role of the intellectual or scholar, if I'll use scholar, if we follow that distinction we made earlier, the role of the scholar should be to see what is underneath, per se, what is kind of there, and to examine that. That seems like a very necessary function that you need in your society, because there's always this tendency for what is underneath to become invisible. Like it's natural. It's like Heidegger talking about the doorknob, right? Like you just use the doorknob and you never notice it. You don't notice the doorknob till it breaks. Well, likewise, when you have a functioning system, the underpinnings that make it possible become invisible. And they may be sources of injustice or oppression or power or different things like that. And that could be a problem. So you need people, it's almost like you have to have people that keep their eye on things that have become invisible, or that keep their eye on the invisible, per se. But that, of course, brings me to Plato's forms, right? These forms that are underneath things that are like invisible and yet present in their absence. You know, I like to call it lacks, which are present absences. You know, they're absent, but they're very present, because their very absence is what makes possible the thing that you are operating within. So I completely agree, if I associate all that we're describing with lack, that the scholar is utterly necessary for keeping your eye on these things that are lacking. That could be very problematic. And that almost then gets you into where the point of thinking is to you almost want to like look for the breaks in the, like these openings, or where the map isn't the territory, this moment where the map flutters up and you can see the territory underneath it for a minute, these kind of glimmers. You're like, hey, look, this whole world in Jane Austen is possible because of a certain system of oppression. We just saw the territory for a minute. You know, there it is. And it's kind of looking at glances and awarenesses to keep people aware, but then it kind of fades away. Like it's like hidden instantly. It's like so hidden, which then maybe, I don't know, you know, maybe that's why the true scholar always has to almost be like the names you gave out, there's almost something prophetic about them, like a voice in the wilderness, and that's why they get thrown in jail, because they're always trying to point out something that's hidden, and the fact that it's hidden is why it's happening, and then it becomes like the invisible doorknob that people need to become aware of to stop, but then, it's hidden. So then when they talk about it, people like throw them in jail because they're crazy. It's almost like the scholar is always talking about, or one of the big roles and necessary roles of the scholar is to make visible the invisible, to point out the hidden, which of course then puts them in a role of seeming crazy, and they can end up in jail. And perhaps we can say the problem that Benton is talking about is that intellectuals no longer want to be crazy. They no longer want to be seen as crazy. They want to be seen as practical and political. They've gotten to the place where they've given into the temptation, almost like Satan in the wilderness with Jesus. Just jump off this ledge. Everyone will see you're king of the earth. The angels will catch you, Jesus, when you jump. Because what is Satan saying to Jesus? He's like, prove to everyone that you are in fact Jesus. Show them that you are in fact, the Son of God or whatever. And Jesus is like, no. Well, likewise, the intellectual or the scholar, they have to not give in to the temptation for everyone to think they're a genius. Like, they want everyone to see them as smart. They want everyone to see them as practical. They want people to see them changing the world. But the moment they give into that temptation, almost like Jesus giving into the wilderness, well, then, they become a force of terror and destruction. Because basically Satan is telling Jesus to become like a dictator. Take over the world, basically, become the benevolent dictator or whatever, take everything over. And it's almost like the intellect has to resist the similar temptation, which if they resist, then they have to position themselves as always talking about the hidden, which then makes them look crazy, like a crazy person or a heretic in Jesus's case. So there's an interesting, now you've inspired me. I want to write like the Grand Inquisitor plus the intellectual and Dostoevsky and the temptations of Satan. I think you're right, what you're saying on the scholar having a role in pointing out the invisible, the lacking, the hidden, that is structured under the society that could be a force of oppression.
And, I included Said on my list. There's an interesting quote where in representations of the intellectual, what he's talking about is that really it has to be somebody who's on the outside is one aspect. And then also he actually advocates that it is the amateur, which he defines as the person who's basically is not connected to profit and, this sort of infrastructure. Now, what's fascinating about this, I included Said on my list. I just think something that's interesting here is that, where he was doing these unmaskings for a substantial period of time is, at Columbia University. And, in the meantime, if you think about that and sort of the centrality of Columbia to this overall story of, the techno-capitalist sort of imperialistic project, they did some of the nuclear research, the splitting of the, in the basement of Columbia, for one thing.
Oh, wow.
Right? So he's doing ideological unmaskings, where hypothetically speaking, he could be unmasked in a certain sense. I don't desire to do that maliciously or whatever, because I don't really see him having done any of his sort of stuff like this. But I know that Columbia during let's say 68 or 69, they were looking at the endowment and how it was invested. A lot of the radicals that were there during the late 60s. So they were worried about military industrial complex. For instance, Eisenhower was the president of Columbia University at one point, so you have that. And so military industrial complex, people investing in companies making napalm, I'm pretty sure that came up. I know it came up with most of the universities. And, basically their involvement in corporations in Central America, and then sort of the kind of stuff Chomsky would speak about with respect to that. So basically the ideological unmasking is being done at this location, which now is basically is strongly connected to, the next imperialism, which may not even have been fully evident, at the time Said was writing. So I think this just suggests that, this stuff is recurrent, that anybody could be like unmasked, that, largely we're all complicit in this stuff, and, something that takes tremendous, basically tremendous humility, because I think of somebody like William Lloyd Garrison, or these sort of abolitionists, like during the Civil War and stuff. There's no profit in, or there was not much of a profit for these gents, speaking out against these sorts of injustices. Yeah. Under those circumstances, a lot of their claims would be unheard. And also, furthermore, like even today, if you're looking for, like child labor, sweatshops, you're looking for like statistics on this. It doesn't appear like there's too many, think tanks that are engaged in the collection of, these sorts of statistics and stuff like this. I feel like round about the year 2000, a lot of this dropped off, perhaps with like the intensification of this overall, system.
Well, what you're saying to me, what's so interesting is, I guess Wilberforce, I guess abolitionists, or Fiery Convictions was a book on an abolition. These different people. What's so interesting is these individuals are telling the truth, right? Like they're telling a lot of the people that you listed off are telling the truth. And we describe like academia, supposedly in the business of truth, are now kind of against truth or different things. There's a real sense in which it's these abolitionists who are actually the true intellectuals, because they're truly telling the truth, right? This is the truth. And it's almost like, we were talking about theory and practice as being this kind of schema under which there is an ideological structure that is being hidden by the schema of theory and practice. Well, what's kind of funny is, a lot of people will say that, truth is power. It's just something that you use to oppress people in different things. It's almost actually as if that schema of theory and practice is what is expressing power, whereas the truth is what would get rid of it. It's almost like truth empowers. It's not just an expression of an oppressive power. Like if you knew the truth, like the truth that African Americans are being abused, that empowers you to stand up for them. And it's almost like, I almost want to say that rationality is the oppressive power, where it's detached from truth and it's just used to become rationalism to create some sort of schema and theory of practice that defends an ideology. Whereas truth is actually what defeats the power. But then, of course, rationality would want us to associate truth with power, because then we won't do anything with truth, and then rationality will be invincible, as autonomous rationality, as David Hume talks about.
So basically, right in line with that. So, it's that you have this the actual practice of what's going on, right? Yes. Basically the entire, eastern side of the globe is subject to this domination ever since like the post-war period. Mm-hmm. And, basically the surplus value of all their labor is like being sent over here in a certain sense. And in the meantime, we have the ideology where, we're sipping lattes and nibbling on charcuterie boards and talking about, equity and inclusion. But, that doesn't extend to people in sweatshops, you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so this is the situation. This is the divide between theory and practice. This is ideology. This is the scenario where Satan disguises himself as angel of light. Yes. As either somebody from the NGO complex. I've heard it called the PowerPoint industrial complex. They're giving these talks in oak-paneled boardrooms about saving the world and so forth.
Oh, and what you're saying, I guess, for me, it's almost like the necessary role of the scholar is to remind people that not all angels aren't Satan, almost. That's angels can be Satan. They can be Satan in disguise. Whereas the public is like, none of them look like Satan. They all look good to me. But the answer is like, no. Keep your eye open. This can happen. And if you forget that this can happen, well, then you can be in trouble because you're going to lose the ability to keep in mind that Satan can show up as an angel of light, to use that distinction. But when Satan is disguised as an angel of light, his quote unquote demonic side is hidden. It is invisible. You cannot see it. And if you don't have a society that is able to remember the possibility of this hiddenness, well, then it will participate potentially in the oppression or the demonic kingdom or whatever language we want to use without even realizing they're doing it. And it's almost like Benda wants to say when the intellectual moves into the political, they stop being able to provide this role. Maybe is something that we can say. And then the society just falls into contributing to these problems.
And I think a lot of that is exactly what we see here.
Yes, I really enjoyed that discussion. I took so many notes down. I'm just amazed by how extraordinarily informed you are on all those topics. Mr. Hansen, thank you for everything that you're doing. The world is a better place because you are in it. And I'm just absolutely always delighted to speak to you. Thank you so much, Mr. Hansen.
Hey, thank you very much.